Most podcasters lose listeners in the first 15 seconds of their episode. 15 seconds. Not because their topic wasn't interesting, but because those first 15 seconds did not earn their listeners' continued attention. And I don't think you need me to tell you that if that first 15 seconds fails to earn your listeners' continued attention, well, it's going to be virtually impossible to grow your podcast because your listener churn will be too high. But by the time you finish listening to this episode, you're going to know exactly how to fix it. Because if your podcast messaging and packaging have convinced someone that they need to hit play, you've already done the hardest part. But your next job as the podcast host is knowing what to say in the first 15 seconds of your episode to convince them that they should stick around. And that is exactly what I'm going to teach you how to do. So grab a pen and get ready to take some notes. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. There are two types of podcast hosts in the world. There's the type that started listening to podcasts, loved them so much that they decided, oh, I'm going to host a podcast of my own. And then they started their podcast and now they don't listen to podcasts anymore. And on the flip side, you've got the hosts who listen to podcasts, started a podcast, and continue listening to podcasts. So whatever camp you fall in, if you have ever listened to a podcast, you have probably heard them start a number of different ways. And without thinking much about it, you probably also know just intuitively how some of them really pull you in and capture your attention right away. Others, not so much. The bigger question that you need to be asking as a podcast host is, what's the difference? And it's all in the listener psychology. So my goal in this episode is not to hand you a word-for-word script of exactly what to say at the start of every episode, because that would never work. But instead, to help you understand what needs to be said in those first 15 seconds to earn a listener's attention and keep them listening. The psychological triggers that will open a loop in your listener's brain that they will have to then listen to your episode to close. So as we go through this episode with everything that I'm sharing here with you here, it's not about the words themselves. Remember this, okay? It's not about the exact words that you say, but it's about your understanding of the psychology behind what you say. That's what's really important here. Now, most hosts will start their episodes with a really warm welcome back to the show, or they'll drop right into some sort of backstory. One show, I'll never forget this. Oh my gosh, one show that I audited one time started with listener reviews and positive listener comments from their listeners. I was 27 minutes into that episode, and they were still reading comments from their listeners. The only reason I was listening at that time was because I was doing an audit for this podcast. Otherwise, you could not have paid me to listen. Other hosts are going to start with like some sort of life update, like, let me catch you up since the last time we recorded an episode here. And others just drop right into the topic with no real hook to speak of, just a boring like, well, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about blah, 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 blah. And something else that you've probably seen done before, or maybe you've done it yourself, is a pull quote. We call these pull quotes, where you actually take something from the middle of the episode, something that a guest said, for example, and use that as the intro. The problem with that is that 9 times out of 10, this makes zero sense to someone listening for the first time out of context. And in fact, it can be kind of jarring for the listener because they feel like they just dropped right into a conversation. And instead of hooking them in, they actually feel lost. They feel like they missed something. So it does the opposite of grab someone's attention, and it actually pushes them away. So the problem with all of these quote unquote podcast openers is that unless it's a loyal listener who already knows the value of what you deliver inside your episodes, nobody else cares. Yet, anyway. All right, I'm talking about everyone but your loyal listeners here. New listeners especially, who are tuning in for the first time. They are deciding within seconds whether to keep listening or not, whether this is worth their time or not. So if your listener consumption rates are low, hint, hint, I'll walk you through how to find out if yours are a couple of episodes back. I'll link it in the show notes below. Then it could be your content. But more likely, it's because of how you're teeing up your content right now. Because at every stage in the listener journey, you are essentially selling, quote unquote, selling someone on why they should keep spending their time with you. It's kind of like a new relationship. You might have to be a little more convincing up front. You know, I remember when I dated my husband, it was a while before I let him see me without makeup. And thinking back, I laugh because that was also a time in my life where I wore makeup every day and like high heels and all the things, did my hair. And I'm like, gosh, I'm so glad that I outgrew that season. But I know you know what I'm saying, because usually when you meet someone new, you want to make a good impression. We all do. It's human nature. We put our best foot forward. And eventually, once you get to know someone, you get more comfortable with them and you feel less afraid to show them the more vulnerable, aka aka messier parts of you, aka how I look most days with zero makeup, hair that I need to wash, wearing my athleisure clothes du jour, okay? So don't misunderstand. I'm not saying to show up as someone you're not. Absolutely not. Your listeners want to meet the real you. Just keep in mind that if your goal is podcast growth, well, then every episode you put out there might just be the first episode that someone hears. So every episode needs to make a good first impression. And a mistake that I see a lot of podcasters making is forgetting that someone new might be listening to that episode for the first time, that might be the first episode that somebody hears. So as a host, you have to hold both in your mind at the same time. You've got your current listeners who love you already, and those are the ones that most of us tend to default talk to whenever we're recording an episode. But you've also got the new listeners who have no idea who you are, and who are naturally going to be a lot more judgy about whether your show is worth their time. You and I both do the same thing whenever we're listening to a new show for the first time. It's like, do I like this? Do I want to keep listening to this? Is this worth my time? What's in it for me? And we're subconsciously asking those questions in our mind as we listen. And just like a first impression that gets made in about 7 seconds in real life, yes, that's short, or online, hold your horses, 0.5 seconds. I'm not making that up. You can Google it. We humans have a pretty good internal BS meter. And so it doesn't take us very long to figure out whether we like a show or not. You're going to get a sense of it in the first few seconds. And so are your new listeners about your show, whether you like that or not. So no matter what type of show you have, the first 10 to 15 seconds of every episode need to lay out what's at stake for your listener. Those first 10 to 15 seconds, you are not just introducing another episode on your show. Your one job in those 15 seconds is to open a loop in their mind that demands closure. It needs to have psychological tension. It needs to make someone instantly curious. It needs to communicate urgency. Why should I keep listening to this and why now? And it needs to explain what's at stake if they listen or if they don't. And if you're like, oh my gosh, Courtney, I have never once thought about the opening sentence of my podcast, and now you're telling me it needs to do all of those things, I promise you, keep listening because I'm about to show you how to do this. Now, some of you might know the name Lindsey Graham. I'm not talking about the senator. I'm talking about the podcast host who is best known for producing American History Tellers, History Daily, Business Movers, American Scandal. I was on a call with him recently, and he was sharing how his team crafts a cold open. This is an industry term for his History Daily podcast, a cold open. And he talked about how much work and how much time goes into crafting just the first 30 seconds of an entire episode, the tee up of your entire episode. Why? Because he knows that if he doesn't grab a listener's attention in the first sentence or two of the episode, he's not going to grab their attention. Think about it. A listener who isn't interested isn't going to keep listening to see if they get interested. This is why your opening hook is so important. So let's break down the anatomy of a great hook. You've probably heard of something called a story arc. Essentially, we are crafting a mini arc in which your listener is the hero in the first 15 seconds of your episode. So if you're familiar with Donald Miller and StoryBrand, the basic gist of this is a hero has a problem, who meets a guide, who gives them a plan to help them avoid failure and end in success. That's all it is. And so, the in-depth StoryBrand version of this is that there's a character of some sort. So the hero in most cases will be your listener. And that hero wants something. Now, if you've got a true crime podcast or a History Daily podcast or a narrative style podcast, you may actually be talking about an actual character in the narrative. But in most cases, especially for educational podcasts, the hero is your listener. Now, the hero is listening because they have a problem. They have something that they want to achieve that they have not been able to achieve yet. Now, there are internal things that are standing in their way of getting that thing that they want to achieve. There are external things that might be standing in their way of getting that thing that they want to achieve. Your job as the host is to know what the problem is and what is it that's standing in their way. And then you, as the guide, step in, the host, who has empathy and authority and who can say, don't worry, I know exactly what problem that you're dealing with. I know what's causing this problem. I know what you've done to try to fix the problem, and I can help you. Here's a clear plan that I'm going to give you to help you win, to help you achieve success and avoid failure. And then the guide calls that hero to action, gives them the next step they need to take, very simple, very direct. shares what will happen if they don't take the action. That raises the stakes and increases the psychological tension and urgency to take action now versus never. And ultimately show them what life can look like when they do take the action. That's the transformation and showing them what's possible, painting the vision that ends in success. Now you might be thinking, holy cow, Courtney, this is a lot for 15 seconds of my episode. Like, wow. Okay. I don't want you to overthink this. The goal here is for this to become second nature, where when you open up your episode and now going forward, you're not going to be able to unhear what I just shared with you in my teasers. You're going to hear this in every opening hook for this podcast. So if you need examples to study, just go in my back catalog and listen to these episodes. Every episode hook or teaser, whatever you want to call it, we call it a teaser, it can be called a hook, should be a tight, condensed version of this story arc in 15 seconds. Now, if you were to hit pause right now and you were to just go back and listen to the opening teaser in this episode, the part that plays before the intro track, you'll notice it's a full 30 seconds, give or take. But these stakes are communicated in the first 15 seconds in just 4 short sentences. So if you're like, okay, Courtney, that is a lot to remember. What I want you to remember is cats. Whether you really like cats in real life or not, that's beside the point, okay? Some people are cat people. Some people are not cat people. I happen to not really be a cat person. We had cats growing up. Now I'm going on a cat tangent. Just remember CATS, C-A.T.S. Character. C is for character. What does your listener need? Why are they listening? Your episode title should be giving them the promise of that episode, the promise that your content is going to deliver. So the worst thing you could do here is have some sort of fluffy, vague intro. The very worst thing you could do here is have AI write your intro because it's going to be generic. Don't be too mysterious here. And don't be too boring either. Like, okay, today on this episode, we are talking about blah. The other thing, though, this is a bit of an art and a science because you don't want to give away too much here as well. My friend Dave Jackson, who's been here on the show, shared a great example of this once. And he said, you can start off with some sort of hook like, you'll never guess what we found in my grandma's attic yesterday. Okay, now I want to know what you found in the attic. Like, tell me what you found, right? He said, but what happens is a lot of hosts will start the episode and say, you'll never guess what we found in my grandma's attic the other day. It was this old painting from 1928, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, okay, well, now you just told me what you found. I don't have any reason to keep listening to your episode. So you want your hook to really zero in on what does your listener need? Why are they listening? What does your episode title promise them? And we need to paint a picture of what it's like to be in that pain. And not just generic like, oh, you don't have podcast growth. Well, listen to this episode. No, like when you open your analytics dashboard and you want to cry because your downloads haven't moved in 90 days or more, despite the hours that you are putting in on your podcast every single week. Like, get visceral with it because that is how they're going to self-identify. This is for me. This host gets me. And guess what it also does? It positions you as the guide. Okay, so focus in on your character. The A in this C.A.T.S acronym is for acceleration. So be thinking about this. Every line of your intro of these first 15 seconds of your podcast should pull the listener forward to listen to the next thing you have to say. Really important. So again, if you go back to this intro, I opened for this episode. Most podcasters lose listeners in the first 15 seconds of their episode. Whoa, what? Okay, not because their topic's not interesting, but because the first 15 seconds of their episode doesn't earn their listeners' continued attention. Okay, so not only am I highlighting a problem, but I'm also talking about briefly, why this happens, and also highlighting, okay, this is something that we need to fix. And so if you notice, and this is just the first 2 sentences here, I'm not going to go word for word. You can go back and listen to it. But basically, each thing that I say is building on the thing I said right before to create forward momentum into the episode. The other thing that you want to do here, the T stands for tension. What's at stake for your listener? What's going to happen if they keep doing what they're doing? Or on the flip side, what's going to change and become possible if they change what they're doing or if they choose a different path? So here's the stakes. If the first 15 seconds of your episode does not earn your listeners' continued attention, it will be virtually impossible to grow your podcast because your listener churn will be too high. But by the time you finish listening to this episode, you're going to know exactly how to fix it. And that is where, as the guide, I step in and say, hey, I'm going to help you. And what that does in your listener's mind psychologically, it creates tension, but it also offers relief. There's a lot happening psychologically here, right? What's at stake for your listener? That's what you need to remember. What will happen if they keep doing what they're doing, or what will change or become possible if they change what they're doing and choose a different path? The S in C.A.T.S stands for specificity. Be specific, be visual, be visceral. Call out the exact pain point that they have, not that they feel overwhelmed. Okay, if you've listened to this show for any length of time, you know how I feel about feeling words. Feeling words are subjective. They are not concrete. How does that overwhelm show up for them? In podcasting, is it that they've got an episode that needs to go out tomorrow that they have to edit and they're doing it at 11 p.m. at night? Yeah, that might feel overwhelming, but how does that overwhelm show up? Overwhelm for a parent is going to look totally different. And it's going to be different for a parent of a toddler versus a parent of a school-age child or a parent of a teenager. So C.A.T.S, character, acceleration, tension, specificity. Avoid these common hook mistakes at all costs. Do not start your episode with your guest's bio or their backstory or your backstory. Do not lead with the topic of what you're talking about instead of the stakes. The stakes of, here is why this topic is important. Here's what will happen if we don't address this topic. Please don't open your episode with welcome back to the blah, blah, blah show. I used to do that in all of my episode hooks, and it was not a great way to hook new listeners. Lesson learned. I speak from experience. Welcome back to the show. Or today we're talking about blah, blah, blah. Just no, like we have to create the tension. We have to create the psychological urgency. We have to create the interest. And it's all in the way that we frame what we're talking about. Also, don't take too long to get to the point. I am guilty of this too. Old episodes of my podcast, the intro was like 2 minutes long. Just like, get to the point, Courtney. Good grief. Like, you should be moving into your intro track, like the actual introduction of the show. You know, for my show, it's like the part that says, hey, you're listening to the blah, blah, blah podcast, or whatever I say in that intro. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Like, that should not take more than 30 seconds to get to. And taking too long to get to the point is one of the fastest ways to lose the interest of your listener. The other thing that I see, this is a subtle one, but it's an important one, because this happens a lot. And it's the mistake of assuming that your audience cares before you've given them a reason to. Your loyal listeners care. They do. They like you. They love you. They want to keep listening. They're going to come back every week. You don't have to worry about your loyal listeners here. But really, you want to focus on the new listeners here. Someone who's listening for the first time. And the other thing you want to do, you want to tease all of this early, because you don't want to bury the value halfway through your episode. Or worse, and I've seen this before, where it's like you save the best for last. Like you save the best part for the very end of your episode. Because very few people are going to make it that far. So you want to put the good stuff up front. So let's look at a couple quick examples. Okay, a boring hook. Welcome back to the show. I'm so excited that you're here. We are talking today about how to grow your podcast audience. Okay, a binge-worthy hook. You think your podcast isn't growing because you need more listeners. But the real problem is that the listeners who are finding your show don't actually have a good reason to keep coming back. Ooh, suddenly the stakes are much higher than, hey guys, we're talking about how to grow your podcast audience today. All right, let's look at another one. Boring hook. I've got a great guest today who's going to teach us about podcast monetization. And again, I'm using podcasting because that's what this podcast is about. So these are the examples that come off the top of my head. You know, like, okay, podcast monetization, like, how many ways to Tuesday can we say that? Let's talk about a binge-worthy hook here. Did you know that most podcasters wait until they have a big audience before monetizing? But the shows that are out there making money right now are the ones who built their show for monetization from episode 1. Jane Doe is the head of podcast monetization at Spotify, and she is with me in the studio right now to show you 3 surprising paths to podcast monetization that you can implement today to start seeing an ROI from your show this month, even if you're just getting started or if you have a small audience. Notice the difference, okay? I know the binge-worthy hook example was a lot more words, but I didn't just say, I've got this amazing guest who's going to teach us about podcast monetization, and they are the so-and-so such and such at such amazing company, and here's their bio, and here's what, like, nobody cares yet. Okay, you got to make your listeners care, and that's the point of the hook. So here's your takeaway from this episode. If you can win your listeners' attention in the first 15 seconds of your episode, you can earn their attention in the next 15 minutes of your episode. The first opening sentences of your episode are no longer, get this out of your head, it is not about introducing a topic. It's about showing your listener why this episode matters to them right now. Think of it like a trailer to a movie. If you're a visual person, right? Remember like back in the day when we would wait for a movie to come out at the movie theater? I remember those days. And we'd be sitting there and be like watching the trailer and you get like, oh my gosh, I really want to see this movie. I really want to see this movie. And then as the movie would get closer to being released, like you'd see the trailer more and more and more, and it would just make you excited about what was to come. And sometimes you would go to the box office, you would buy tickets, you'd see the movie, and the movie actually was terrible. And the trailer just did a really good job of teasing the content, and the movie wasn't really all that great. Other times it really did live up to expectation. But I want you to think of the trailer like a movie. And then of course, here, we want your content to live up to that expectation. So remember the C.A.T.S framework and remember that story arc. Essentially, the C.A.T.S framework condenses that story arc into a simple acronym that you can remember that focuses on your listener, that sparks curiosity, that creates psychological urgency, that gets them emotionally invested in what you have to say next fast. So I'm going to challenge you here. I want you to go back to your last 3 episode openings, and I want you to rework them using the C.A.T.S framework for practice. You don't have to re-record them, but I want you to rework them to practice. And then for your episodes going forward, I want you to practice using this framework in your opening hooks and see how that affects your listener retention over time. Now, if over time you notice your listener retention really doesn't change, that could have to do less with the hook itself, and that would be an indicator there's more we need to do in the body of your episode content. But in many, many cases, listener retention is often affected by what happens in those first 15 seconds of the episode. So if this was helpful for you, I would love it if you would take just a few seconds right now, scroll down on whatever app you're listening on, tap the 5 stars. That lets me know that this content was valuable for you. But more importantly, it lets other listeners know who are finding this show for the first time that this show is going to be worth the listen. And then don't go anywhere, because in the next episode, you're going to get to hear what going from boring to binge-worthy actually sounds like. I'm going to take you behind the scenes of a real podcast makeover, from a show with a great topic, but that had very little traction, to one that broke the top 100 on Apple Podcasts after its relaunch, and finally nailed how to communicate exactly what this show's listeners needed to hear. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.